Coming up on Arirang News, data show the number of people employed in South Korea fell last month by the most since 2009. Almost 200,000 jobs lost as people stayed home because of the coronavirus. The IMF projects the economies of the G20 countries will contract by 2.8% this year, but among those, South Korea's will shrink the least. China, already for the first quarter, has its first on-year contraction in decades. And the Trump administration issues new guidelines for reopening the American economy. It recommends the states let people go back to work while sticking to social distancing and factoring in the rate of new infections. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. South Korea reported 22 new cases of COVID-19 on Friday, the fifth straight day that new infections have stayed below 30. The Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says the daily number of new cases has been below 50 for the last 9 days. However, it called on the public to keep practicing social distancing due to a number of imported cases, as well as cluster infections at hospitals and churches. Total infections now stand at 10,635, with the death toll at 230. The United States is allowing NGOs to provide humanitarian aid to North Korea. The Office of Foreign Assets Control at the Treasury Department released a new fact sheet Thursday on the provision of humanitarian assistance and trade to combat COVID-19. NGOs will be allowed to provide the regime with items such as testing kits, respiratory devices, personal protective equipment, and medicine. The office also authorized limited transactions with North Korea, including the payment of reasonable fees, taxes, utility bills, and import duties, and the purchase of permits and licenses. A clearer picture is emerging of the economic fallout facing South Korea as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. South Korea's jobs report is out, and it shows job losses in March were the highest since the global financial crisis. Kim Jae-hee has this report.
South Korea last month saw the biggest decline in the number of jobs in almost 11 years. March's fall was largely attributed to the coronavirus pandemic, which has already caused immense damage to the global economy. According to Statistics Korea on Friday, the number of employed people in South Korea in March fell to some 26.6 million. That's down around 195,000 compared to the same month last year, marking the largest on-year fall since May 2009. The employment rate for those aged between 15 to 64 was at 65.4%, down 0.8 percentage points compared to last year. The employment rate for those aged between 15 and 29 also fell. It was 41%, down 1.9 percentage points. The virus also caused a massive rise in the number of people taking time off work. A total of some 1.6 million people took a temporary leave of absence in March, up more than 1.2 million from a year earlier. This is the largest on-year increase since statistics began in 1983. One expert says the government needs to safeguard businesses until the outbreak is under control.
Okay, for now, the primary job of the government has to be controlling the COVID virus. Well, until the COVID virus is under control, the government has to make sure that the companies do not go out of business and the unemployed have reasonable amount of income.
The Finance Ministry on Friday also gave a grim economic outlook. Its monthly Green Book report highlighted that South Korea's domestic consumption contracted, and there were growing uncertainties surrounding outbound shipments. Consumer sentiment for March was also around 78, far below 100, meaning more people are pessimistic than optimistic about the local economy. Amid the grim economic outlook, the Finance Ministry has pledged to come up with measures to improve the domestic economy and the dire employment figures. Kim Jae-hee, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, global strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, thank you as always for coming on.
Good afternoon.
Well, stocks in New York overnight were up a bit, the Nasdaq by a substantial amount, the employment data, other things looking worse and worse. So what was behind the gain there and in other global markets?
Yes, if you look at the Wall Street, it closed in green, or it has risen, as the investors continues to assess the impact of the pandemic on economic growth and also the flattening of the curves in the U.S. If you look at the New York and other East Coast states, they have decided to extend the shutdown of non-essential businesses to May 15th, so by another 2 weeks. Coronavirus cases in U.S. climbed to 670,000 cases, while death toll rose to 34,000 plus. Also, the Labor Department announced that the total unemployment benefit filed by employees were 5.245 million people, which is actually lower than expectation of about 6.1 million. And that has resulted into clearly some positive implication for some of the movement that we saw in U.S. market. However, though, still there is a concern about the jobless rate. The total of about last 4 weeks, about 22 million people, that is equal to 13% of unemployment if they are continue to be unemployed. So clearly, these are some of the reasons why the markets were kind of volatile. But nevertheless, market did rose because of the continued liquidity injection that was happening in the market, and we are seeing. There's possibility of some easing in terms of the shutdowns in the global scales. So all in all, a bit of doubts, but nevertheless, markets were recovering due to the COVID-19 cases flattening.
And futures green across the board there as well, but big gains in the Korean markets today. The Kospi back above 1,900. Just a few weeks ago, it was in the 1,400s. What's the story in local stocks?
Sure. I think it's because of these the new drugs that might be, drugs that was already announced, but it seems to be having some impact. The Gilead was talking about the drugs that is having a quite positive implications, and that resulting into quite a big jump in terms of the futures market for the U.S. You are seeing S&P 500 futures going up by 2.7, 2.8%. The Nasdaq futures up more than 2%. And clearly that has a positive implication for Korean market. And also the Korean government have decided to put additional injection of liquidity to the system. And clearly this is a positive news. Overall, we are seeing continuation of liquidity injection as well as the new additional case of the coronavirus 19 cases for Korea remains to a very low number of less than 30 people per day. And that has resulted into quite a sharp rise of the equity market. If you look at Kospi, it was up more than 3.1%. Kosdaq was up 1.8%. Clearly, quite a significant recovery since the market crashed down to below 1,500. Now it's well above 1,900 territories at this point in time.
Well, as we heard a minute ago, Statistics Korea showing the number of employed people in the country last month down by almost 200,000. Looking at the markets, though, that doesn't seem like investors took it as a surprise or vastly worse than expected. What do you make of these numbers?
Sure. Clearly, the number is actually not too bad. Of course, it is that the case that the unemployment ratio has jumped. The unemployment rate of South Korea jumped to 3.8% in March. From 3.3% in the previous month. But if you compare that the numbers to the other countries, you're looking at U.S. having 4.4% unemployment ratios last month and expected to see more than 13% numbers maybe coming through if these things actually happens. Now, also, if you look at the GDP growth rate adjustment, you are seeing Korea's adjustment down to maybe minus 1.2%, whereas the global economy, you're looking at more than 3% decline or plus. So yes, it is a negative implication, but nevertheless, the level of the decline is relatively less to other countries. And also, we just had the elections, and which turned out to be quite good results in a sense that we will see quite an aggressive boosting measure coming through from the government due to the skewed Parliament. All being said, we think that there will be continuation of the boosting measures from the Korean government, as well as we are seeing some of these industries having relative competitiveness in terms of the export-related industries, including the semiconductor business, as well as recent days bio sectors. So all being said, Korea seems to be doing relatively better than other countries, and that is resulting into the probably stronger recovery than most of other markets.
Got it. All right, Mr. Yu, thanks so much for coming on today. Have a great weekend.
Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.
Now, the IMF is projecting that the global economy will contract significantly this year, but among the G20 countries, South Korea's economy will shrink the least. Kim Bo-kyung tells us more.
The International Monetary Fund is projecting that G20 nations will see negative growth of minus 2.8% this year due to the COVID-19 outbreak. The IMF's G20 Surveillance Note's latest projection, released on Thursday, is a 6.2 percentage point drop from its previous forecast in January. It also slashed South Korea's economic outlook to minus 1.2%, a 3.4 percentage point drop from its previous projection. Yet, it was the smallest cut among the major 20 countries, showing a less severe impact on the South Korean economy, while advanced economies such as the US, Japan, and Germany are forecast to contract on average of 6%. To mitigate the global economic fallout, the IMF said some 50 countries will receive help by the end of the month, with over 100 countries asking for help. To support the poorest members, 5 developed countries, including Japan, France, and Canada, have promised around $11.7 billion upon the IMF's urgent request.
We have been able to strengthen our concessional capacity. We've got 70% of our ask met by commitments of the members. And I want to thank wholeheartedly Japan, the UK, France, Australia, and Canada for making firm commitments totaling $11.7 billion.
Saying such an outcome in record short time was possible due to the spirit of global solidarity, the IMF chief added the agency is committed to help countries that are burdened by debt so they can tackle the crisis effectively. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
And because of China's coronavirus shutdown, data show the country's economy shrank in the first quarter. For the year, the IMF still expects China's GDP will grow, but only by around 1%. Yoon Jung-min has the details.
The Chinese economy contracted for the first time in decades in the first quarter. China's National Bureau of Statistics said Friday that from January to March, the country's GDP was down 6.8% on year. Compared to the previous quarter, growth declined by 12 percentage points. This is the first time China has officially posted negative growth for any period since 1976, though quarterly figures weren't published until 1992. To stop the coronavirus epidemic, the Chinese government imposed large-scale shutdowns in January and only gradually resumed economic activities in March. In the first quarter, China's industrial production fell by more than 8% on year, while retail sales slumped 19%.
There has been a clear improvement in March compared with January and February. With the reopening of business and production and the continuous adoption of more dynamic policies, performance in the second quarter will be better.
In its latest report, the International Monetary Fund has predicted China's economy will grow by only 1.2% this year. That's far lower than its earlier projection of 6% growth, but significantly better than the IMF's forecast of minus 2.8% on average for the G20 nations as a whole. To boost the Chinese economy, the authorities are expected to implement policies of intensive monetary and fiscal expansion. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
New guidelines have been released by the White House outlining a phased approach to resuming normal economic activity in the United States. However, President Trump and his coronavirus task force team say it'll only be for regions with solid testing systems and places seeing a consistent downtrend in COVID-19 cases. Chae Won-jung reports.
President Trump has outlined a three-phase set of guidelines to gradually restart the economy. At a coronavirus task force briefing at the White House on Thursday local time, Trump announced plans to allow the phased reopening of closed businesses with strict guidelines.
Our country has suffered. The world has suffered. 184 other countries have suffered. Therefore, my administration is issuing new federal guidelines that will allow governors to take a phased and deliberate approach to reopening their individual states.
In a three-phase approach, people are recommended to avoid socializing, public gatherings, visits to senior care facilities, and visits to hospitals. Large venues, movie theaters, and restaurants are allowed to reopen under certain conditions, while schools and daycare centers will remain closed. Meanwhile, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo expressed his hesitancy to lift the state lockdown. He asked people to stay home by extending his statewide shutdown until April 15th. As of Thursday, the U.S. surpassed 670,000 cases of COVID-19 with more than 33,000 deaths. 최원정, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.